88,000 men were a heartbeat away from total surrender. Behind them lay a 50-mile trail of abandoned equipment and shattered pride, the result of a Nazi onslaught that had convinced the world the American soldier was a paper tiger. This was the wreckage of Kasserine Pass. But on March 6, 1943, a man with ivory-handled pistols arrived to prove that an army is only as dangerous as the spirit of the man leading it. General George S. Patton didn't come to North Africa to negotiate. He came to murder the Nazi myth of invincibility, one necktie at a time. To understand the man who would eventually haunt the dreams of the German High Command, one must look back to the cold, salt-sprayed morning of November 8, 1942. At that moment, George Patton was not a legend. He was a desperate gambler leading 35,000 men across 4,000 miles of an Atlantic Ocean teeming with predatory U-boat packs. This was Operation Torch, the largest amphibious invasion ever attempted by the Western Allies. A mission so complex that the planning documents alone weighed over 100 pounds and required 2 full mail bags to transport. Patton stood on the deck of the heavy cruiser Augusta, staring into the dark Moroccan mist, knowing that his entire life had been a mere dress rehearsal for this singular moment of violent transition. He believed in reincarnation, in the idea that he had stood on these same shores as a Roman legionnaire or a cavalry officer under Napoleon. And as the first rays of light touched the coast of Casablanca, he felt the weight of destiny pressing against his chest. The silence of the Atlantic was shattered not by a whisper, but by the roar of 15-inch shells as the Vichy French battleship Jean Bart began her defiant, one-sided duel with the American fleet. Patton, ever the dramatist, refused to take cover even as the Augusta accelerated to 20 knots, her own turrets screaming in reply to the French batteries. In a moment of pure cinematic chaos, the very first blast from his own ship's turrets blew Patton's personal landing boat to splinters right off the davits. He lost his extra uniforms, his personal gear, and his vanity in that explosion, yet as the smoke cleared, he remained standing, clutching the only things that truly defined his warrior image, his ivory-handled revolvers. He would go ashore in Morocco, not as a pampered general, but as a warrior stripped of everything but his weapons and his will to conquer. The naval battle of Casablanca was a brutal, swirling melee of zigzagging cruisers and burning destroyers, a baptism of fire that claimed hundreds of lives before the French finally realized that the Americans were not there to play at war. By November 11, 1942, the smoke had cleared, and Patton found himself in the opulent, high-ceilinged rooms of the Hotel Miramar in Fadala, facing the men he had just been trying to kill. This was the first test of Patton's political instincts, a moment where the old blood and guts persona had to give way to the gentleman general. He met Admiral Michelier and General Noguet with a calculated old-world dignity that stunned the French officers who expected a crude barbarian. He complimented the bravery of their sailors, and in an act of strategic brilliance, he rejected the harsh, formal armistice terms dictated by his superiors in favor of a gentleman's agreement. Patton understood a truth that many in Washington did not. A humiliated Morocco would become a chaotic Morocco, and a chaotic Morocco would drain American resources away from the hunt for the Nazis. He allowed the French to keep their sidearms, to remain in their barracks with their dignity intact, and he concluded the negotiations with a toast to the liberation of France from a common enemy. This gesture did more than secure the beaches. It turned a defeated foe into a silent partner, allowing Patton to secure his rear and look toward the east, where the real wolf was waiting. That wolf was Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, and his arrival in Tunisia was about to turn the American dream of an easy victory into a cold, bloody nightmare. While Patton was consolidating Morocco, the American Second Corps was being pushed into the rugged, unforgiving terrain of the Tunisian interior, led by a man who was Patton's polar opposite, Major General Lloyd Fredendall. Fredendall was a creature of the rear, a commander who ordered a massive, deep-earth bunker to be constructed 70 miles behind the front lines, while his men were being slaughtered in the mountain passes. The leadership was disconnected, the logistics were a shambles, and the troops were green, citizen soldiers who had never seen the terrifying efficiency of a German Panzer Division in full flight. In February 1943, the hammer finally fell at Kasserine Pass, where the 10th and 21st Panzer Divisions executed a masterclass in maneuver warfare that left the American army shattered. The statistics of the defeat were staggering. 3,000 Americans killed or wounded, another 3,000 marched into German captivity, and 183 tanks left as blackened, hollowed-out skeletons in the desert sand. The Second Corps had been pushed back over 50 miles in a disorderly, chaotic retreat that shook the foundations of Allied confidence. Dwight D. Eisenhower, witnessing the collapse of his southern flank, realized that he didn't just need a new commander, he needed a fundamental change in the very DNA of the American soldier. On March 6, 1943, he made the decision that would change the course of the war in North Africa. He sent for George Patton. When Patton arrived at the Second Corps headquarters in Tebessa, he didn't see a military unit. He saw a dispirited mob of men who had lost the ability to salute and the desire to fight. He walked into the mess hall at 10 in the morning to find officers still lingering over coffee, a sight that caused his face to turn a shade of crimson that the staff would soon learn to fear more than German artillery. Patton's first order of business wasn't a tactical maneuver. It was an assault on the lethargy of the command. He ordered the mess halls closed at 7:30 sharp, and he began a shock treatment of discipline that seemed absurd to the men on the ground, but was rooted in a deep understanding of the human psyche. Patton mandated that every man, from the cooks to the frontline infantry, wear full uniform, including neckties, leggings, and heavy steel helmets with the chin straps buckled, even while in the latrines. He imposed $25 fines for the smallest infraction, a massive sum for a private in 1943, and he patrolled the camps like a vengeful god, searching for a single unpolished button or a missing salute. He used Martian speech, a profanity-laced, aggressive rhetoric that the men called the language of the barracks, to remind them that the pre-Kasserine days of play soldiering were dead. He told them that an army is a team, and that the only way they would ever see home again was to walk through the ruins of Berlin. The men grew to loathe him, but in that shared hatred, they found a strange new unity. As Omar Bradley, Patton's deputy, each time a soldier knotted his tie in the heat of the desert, he was reminded that he belonged to a professional organization that demanded absolute obedience. Patton was burning away the valor of ignorance and replacing it with a hard, brittle edge of institutionalized discipline. He had only 10 days to transform this broken force before they were ordered back into the meat grinder for Operation WOP, a mission to seize Gafsa and the strategic hills of El Guettar to support General Montgomery's 8th Army. Patton was a man obsessed with movement, believing that speed is the only antidote to fear, and as the March offensive loomed, he pushed his divisions toward the eastern dorsal mountains with a relentless, driving energy. He noticed that the infantry lacked the specialized support needed to survive a confrontation with German armor. So he made a critical tactical gamble. He attached the 601st Tank Destroyer Battalion to the frontline regiments. The 601st was a unit of stopgap weapons, mounting old World War I French 75 cannons onto the backs of thinly armored M3 half-tracks. These were the Purple Heart boxes, vehicles so fragile that a single German machine gun could tear through their sides. Yet they were all that stood between the 1st Infantry Division and the steel bulk of the Nazi war machine. On the eve of the battle, Patton addressed his staff with a chilling finality. "Gentlemen, tomorrow we attack. If we are not victorious, let no one come back alive." He wasn't interested in holding ground or tactical retreats. He wanted to hold the enemy by the nose and kick him in the pants. He spent the night in prayer, convinced that he was once again standing at the center of the world stage, ready to confront the ghosts of his past in the very real steel of the 10th Panzer Division. The town of Gafsa fell quickly, the Italians retreating before the American advance. But Patton knew that the real test was waiting in the dusty, boulder-strewn valley of El Guettar. He sped into the town in a command car, apologizing to reporters that he wasn't in a tank because his personal vehicle hadn't caught up with him yet. He radiated a confidence that he didn't entirely feel, privately worrying about a cold sore on his lip while publicly acting the part of the invincible conqueror. He was looking for the Germans, daring them to show themselves, knowing that until the Americans beat a Panzer Division in a fair fight, the shadow of Kasserine would never truly lift. In the early morning hours of March 23, 1943, the silence of the Tunisian desert was replaced by the low, guttural throb of 50 German tanks. General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim, believing the Americans were still a scrub team that would break at the first sign of pressure, unleashed the 10th Panzer Division into the valley. They came in a perfect three-sided screen, the moonlight glinting off their armor as they charged toward the American artillery positions. This was the moment Patton had been waiting for, the first direct, large-scale engagement between his new army and the finest soldiers the Third Reich could field. As the sun began to peek over the eastern horizon, the desert floor suddenly erupted. The German main force had blundered into a hidden American minefield, and in the space of a few seconds, 8 panzers were transformed into pillars of fire. The Purple Heart boxes of the 601st Battalion, hidden behind the low ridges, began their deadly scoot and shoot ballet, popping up to fire a single high-velocity shell before plunging back into the safety of the wadis. The Nazi Leviathan was being stung by 1,000 small, violent wounds, and for the first time in the war, it was the Germans who were beginning to feel the cold touch of panic. The initial German charge at El Guettar had been blunted by the minefields and the frantic bravery of the tank destroyers. But by 6 in the morning, the 10th Panzer Division was regrouping for a more methodical slaughter. They were veteran killers, men who had seen the gates of Moscow and the ruins of Warsaw, and they were not about to be denied by a group of Americans they still viewed as tourist soldiers. The German infantry, the Panzer Grenadiers, began to infiltrate the hills, moving with a fluid, terrifying precision that threatened to outflank the American artillery batteries that were the only thing keeping the line from collapsing. Patton was not in a bunker 70 miles away. He was on the move, his command car kicking up a plume of dust as he raced toward the front lines. He arrived at the command post of Major General Terry de la Mesa Allen, the commander of the 1st Infantry Division, just as a German shell exploded nearby, peppering his vehicle with shards of hot iron. Patton didn't flinch. He grabbed his silver-tipped cane and began climbing a steep, rocky hill to get a better view of the carnage below. He stood on the crest, a perfect target for any German sniper, and watched through his binoculars as the American Big Red 1 infantry held their ground against a wave of motorcycle sidecars and half-tracks. The tactical situation was a nightmare of fire and shadow. The 10th Panzer had split its force, sending a northern wing to overrun the American gun pits, while the main body of tanks swept left to broaden their front toward the Salt Lake. The Americans were being squeezed, and for a moment, it looked like the ghost of Kasserine was back to claim its due. But Patton's discipline had taken root. The artillerymen of the 5th Field Artillery Battalion didn't run. They lowered their sights and fired point-blank into the advancing German armor, the muzzle blast scorching the desert air as they fought for their lives. In the center of the storm were the men of the 601st Tank Destroyer Battalion. Their M3 half-tracks were outgunned and out-armored, but they had learned the lesson of scoot and shoot. They used the rolling terrain as a shield, engaging the panzers at ranges of less than 1,000 yards. Sergeant Raymond, a tank commander in the 601st, maneuvered his fragile vehicle to within range of a massive Mark VI Tiger, firing 6 rounds with a hand-crank gun until the German behemoth finally caught fire. This was the raw, unvarnished reality of Patton's war. Men in thin-skinned trucks fighting and winning against the heaviest armor in the world. By 9:30 that morning, the Valley of El Guettar was a graveyard of German ambition. 30 German tanks lay smoldering in the dust, their crews scrambling away from the wreckage as American artillery airbursts turned the sky into a canopy of shrapnel. Patton watched the German retreat with a cold, professional assessment, noting in his diary that the enemy was murdering their own good infantry by sending them into such a concentrated fire zone. He realized then that the Nazi machine was not a collection of supermen, but a methodical force that could be outthought and outfought by a commander with enough audacity. However, the day was only half over. Allied intelligence had intercepted German radio traffic indicating that von Arnim was furious and had ordered a second massive assault for late that afternoon. Patton didn't use the lull to rest, he used it to reload. He ordered more ammunition brought forward under fire and personally visited the foxholes, telling his men that the Germans were yellow-bellied sons of bitches, whose eyes were as yellow as their cowardice. He was building a legend in the dirt, a psychological shield that would protect his men when the next wave of steel arrived. The second attack came at 4:45 in the evening, but the Germans had learned a bitter lesson from the morning's slaughter. This time they put their infantry in the lead, spreading them out among the tanks to protect the armor from the American scoot and shoot tactics. It was a reversal of the blitzkrieg, a sign that the Americans had finally forced the masters of the offensive to hesitate. The desert air was filled with the scream of Stuka dive bombers, their sirens wailing like banshees as they plunged toward the American ridges. But the discipline of the Second Corps held firm. Patton's artillery observers waited with agonizing patience, watching through their periscopes as the German line reached the 1,500-yard mark. Then they unleashed a methodical airburst bombardment, a wall of steel that exploded just above the heads of the advancing German grenadiers. The carnage was absolute. Terry Allen's Big Red One and Darby's Rangers rose from their foxholes, their M1 Garons barking as they poured fire into the survivors. For 2 hours, the hills echoed with the sounds of a desperate close-quarter struggle, but the American line did not bend. At the height of the tension, a flight of German Focke-Wulf 190s swept low over the valley, their cannons stitching paths of fire across the American positions. Patton, still standing in the open, refused to duck, staring up at the butcher birds, as if his own will could knock them out of the sky. He wanted his men to see him, to know that if their general didn't fear death, then neither should they. This was the weaponization of image, the belief that a commander's presence on the front line was as powerful as 1,000 shells. The 10th Panzer Division finally broke. Realizing that they could not pierce the American shield, they turned their remaining vehicles and retreated toward Gabes, leaving the valley floor to the Americans. The cost of victory was high. The 601st Tank Destroyer Battalion had been virtually wiped out, losing 21 of its 31 vehicles and many of its best men. But as the smoke cleared, the atmosphere in the Second Corps was unrecognizable from the days of Kasserine. The dispirited mob had become a winning team, and the American soldier had learned the most valuable lesson of the war. The Nazi Superman could be beaten. In the quiet of his quarters that night, Patton wrote a letter to his wife, admitting for the first time that he had been really scared of the air attacks initially, but that he had grown used to it. He believed his spirit was enlarging with the responsibility of command, and he felt a grim satisfaction in the knowledge that he had turned a disaster into a triumph in just 17 days. He was already thinking of the next move, frustrated that he had been ordered to hold his position rather than chase the Germans into the sea. "I hate fighting from the rear," he complained in his diary, already hungry for the vitesse of a true armored breakout. The German perspective on Patton was beginning to shift from total ignorance to a growing, uneasy curiosity. Captured German prisoners were brought to the rear, and many of them asked their captors with wide, fearful eyes, "Is Patton near?" They had felt the change in American aggression, the way the Second Corps now moved with a purpose and a ferocity that matched their own. General Gunther Blumentritt would later remark that Patton was the only Allied general who truly understood the classical military commander's need for speed and offense. Patton's reforms had not just won a battle, they had fundamentally re-educated the United States Army. Even Erwin Rommel, writing in his private papers, admitted that while the Americans had paid a stiff price at Kasserine, they had used the experience to become a professional force. Patton had shown that discipline, even the seemingly trivial discipline of a necktie or a polished boot, was the framework upon which combat courage was built. He had weaponized the pride of the American soldier, and in doing so, he had created the force that would eventually liberate a continent. As the Tunisian campaign moved toward its inevitable conclusion, Patton was ordered to hand over command of the Second Corps to his deputy, Omar Bradley, so that he could return to Morocco to plan the invasion of Sicily. He left behind a corps that was now the equal of any in the world, a unit that had found its soul in the fire of El Guettar. The road to Berlin was still long and paved with 1 million casualties, but the beginning of the end had truly been reached in the dust of North Africa. The legacy of Patton's first victory was more than tactical, it was an existential shift. The world now knew that the industrial giant of the West had found its teeth. As the P-40 Warhawks landed on the captured airfields near Port Louis, and the American infantry prepared for their next jump across the Mediterranean, the image of Patton with his ivory-handled revolvers became a symbol of a nation that was no longer willing to be afraid. He had met his destiny in the desert, and he had proven that in war, the mind of the commander is the ultimate weapon. If you were General Eisenhower, would you have kept Patton in command of the Second Corps to finish the North African campaign? Or was he too valuable as a strategic, theatrical asset to be used for the next big invasion in Sicily? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell.